Welcome to our excursus on the David and Batsheva story. As I try to point out in the shiur, we're tackling a unique and uniquely challenging topic. David is perhaps one of the most beloved figures in Tanakh, and I believe we are rightly apprehensive about discussing his sins, especially when they appear to be so egregious. However, to fail to do so in a mature and exhaustive way shirks the responsibility entrusted to us by Hashem when he dictated that this story be included in Tanakh. Furthermore, though we will cite sources from Chazal which seek to minimize, if not essentially eliminate, David's transgressions, we will choose to follow Rishonim, who I believe rightly see this as doing violence to the text. Such readings have a valid place as derash, but our goal is to hew as close to the text as possible. If the pesukim, the Navi, and David all say he sinned, then we must contend with the actual events, not water down apologetics. In the end, perhaps the part of the reason David is so eternally and broadly loved is that in spite of his failings, how he chooses to respond when he's forced to take a long, hard look in the mirror is unique. Substantively, besides reviewing the statements of Chazal, we look at the whole incident as an inversion of the Yosef Eshes Potiphar story. We then look for a framework in the Torah which can give us a better psychological understanding of David and find it in the Parsha of Yafat Toar. We then seek to expand the theological underpinnings by tracing the root of this sin through Tanakh back to Gan Eden. Finally, we contrast what took place with the correct alternative model, that of shepherding, while leaving in abeyance the question of how a king who is supposed to be the paradigm of alignment with the will of God can recover from such failure, and why David is even given a chance while Shaul is not. All this and more. Thanks for joining us.
Just want to dedicate the learning to for Sahal and for the continued the return of the hostages and the continued destruction of our enemies.
Amen. Good health and protection of the soldiers.
Yeah, amen. Okay, so last time we read through chapter 11, and we didn't really discuss too much about the story of David and Batsheva. There are whole books written on this, such as some of the ones that you see over there. Mm-hmm. Although most of them have just chapters, but the book on top is Rav Yaakov Meidan.
Biblical seduction.
Yeah, there you go. Rav Yaakov Meidan has a whole book, and it's wonderful. And I mentioned, I think last time in the warning, and I want to just sort of reiterate, like we're going to talk about David and Avera that he did, and it's really hard because, like, I love David. Mm-hmm. Right, David, like that's his name. He's literally beloved to the Jewish people. I don't think there's anybody else in Tanakh that just his name is mentioned more in Tanakh than anybody else, including Moshe. The Jewish people love him, and I don't want to
impugn.
Yeah, right. I don't want to take away from that in any way, but
let's deal with it in an adult and real way.
Yeah, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu had the Navi put it in the book for a reason, mm-hmm. and he put it there for us to grapple with. There was a choice to not put it in the book, and that's Divrei Yomim. Divrei Yomim skips the story entirely, right? So that was an option. So if it's there for us to grapple with, and to hopefully come away with a deeper and more profound appreciation for both the lesson that the Navi wants us to get, but also for an understanding of David HaMelech and who he was. Some quick points to point out before we try to dive into the story itself. Just in terms of the character arc, we saw this with Shaul, that he goes through this transition where he reaches kind of the height of his success, and then it kind of goes downhill, right? With David, it seems much quicker. Shaul sort of descended into madness. David went from the height of Hashem telling him, "You're going to build a house for me, I'm going to build a house for you, you're amazing," and the Navi says to him, "Do whatever you want, Hashem is with you," to a few prakim later, he's at the nadir, like he's in the bottom rung of his character arc, so to speak, and it's a little jarring. We noticed two sort of patterns in the parak. One is this repeated use of the shoresh shalach. There were all these messengers, shlichim, that were being sent back and forth. The other thing we noted is that everybody who was told to do something didn't do what they were told to do. So Uriah is told to go home, he doesn't listen. Yoav is told to kill Uriah, and so he doesn't listen. Like, everybody is instructed, and then they don't do what they're supposed to do. So I think if we put those two things together, the overarching message to you, the reader, is David is supposed to be the shaliach of Hashem. He's not doing what he's supposed to do, right? That's the whole theme of the parak, is exactly that. It's also interesting to note that with his taking of Batsheva, this is the fourth woman that David marries who had been married to someone else previously. We have Achinoam, who was married to Shaul. We're going to see more about that explicitly, I think, in the coming prakim. Michal was married to Paltiel, and David takes her back to him. Abigail's married to Naval, and Batsheva was married to Uriah. Like 1 or 2 is a coincidence, but when you get to 4, I think we have a pattern on our hands.
Right, no virgins, and then Abishag, who is a virgin, he doesn't
marry. Right.
Right.
Specifically, you're not married to anybody. Okay, then I can't. There is an essay from Seth Postel, who adds some very compelling comparisons between David and Yosef in general, and especially the episode with Yosef and Eshet Potiphar as kind of being the opposite, or David and Batsheva being sort of the opposite or the inversion of the Yosef Potiphar story. I'm just going to paraphrase some of the highlights. So I think we talked about this a little bit in Shmuel Aleph, but David starts off his career as being a shepherd to the sheep of his father, which is the same way that Yosef starts off his career. In fact, the same phrase, this phrase of Roes son aviv, is used only by David and Yosef. The phrase that describes the other brothers watching their father's sheep is not the same wording. They're both, David and Yosef, are sent by the father to go check on the brothers. That when the person who is sent, whether it's David or Yosef, meets up with the brothers, they respond in a very derogatory way. David and Yosef are both chosen to serve the king because they are both described as discerning men. Those are the only 2 people in all of Tanakh who are described as discerning men.
Which Hebrew word?
I have to.
Discerning means like.
So we can look it up. It's Bereshis 41:33.
Oh, what's the Hebrew word?
Yeah.
Men of discerning taste.
I think it's like Chacham Unavons. Let's see.
I don't often
30.
drink beer, but when I do, I drink Dos Equis.
Ish Navon v'Chacham.
Understanding and wise.
Discerning and wise is how the JPS translates it. We're also told that Hashem is with them, and that's really the whole reason that Yosef was prospering in Mitzrayim. Yosef and David are also the only 2 men who are described as beautiful of appearance in all of Tanakh, and they both have Jewish enemies, either Shaul or the brothers, who use non-Jews, like the Plishtim or the Yishmaelim, to harm them so that they can keep their hands clean, right? There's a lot more textual comparisons in the language, but I think you get the point. Now, what about Potiphar's wife? So in both the story with Yosef and Eshet Potiphar and David and Batsheva, you have a married person with royal influence who sees the object of their desire, who is alone in the house. Both stories, the victimizer tries unsuccessfully over several days to persuade a servant who's very loyal to his lord to lay with a woman. The victim offers a speech to the victimizer as to why it would be morally wrong to lie with that woman. In both accounts, the victimizer punishes the innocent victim for their refusal to sleep with the women, and in both cases, the individual who's responsible for meting out the punishment is the Lord, whom the victim was supposed to be extremely loyal to. So Uriah says, my master Yoav, how could I do that to him? And then Yoav is the one who has to punish him. The same with Potiphar, who Yosef is being loyal to, is the one who ends up throwing him in jail. What the academics won't do is try to tell you why. Why is Hashem choosing to present the story of David and Batsheva as the inverse of Eshet Potiphar? And we're going to try to see a little bit more about that as we go along. But I think the comparison is pretty clear. Yes?
Gets a little looser at some places than others.
Okay, but the broad strokes I think are there. So here's the first question that we need to start with is, did David sin? What is your take? Pretty clear,
Yeah.
right?
First of all, he says he does.
Right. So
the
problem is Chazal said we're not allowed to say.
Okay. So very good.
Right,
So
but the thing is, first of all,
I'm not
okay,
answering
the
that
kid that he has with her is a stillborn, and I feel like that's gotta, especially the Navi prophesies the kid's not going to do okay
Yeah, that's a
because of what he did. And I know I'm getting ahead of ourselves, like from, maybe you want to talk from this point in the story, but looking at what happens afterwards, Natan Natan and Navi lays the smackdown on David Amelech. Like, hey, what gives?
Right, and
You
David
And David's like, yeah,
says,
you're right. I screwed up.
I have to do
Right.
teshuvah.
I mean, so that
right.
the fact that
Tehillim
there's
Nun
two-
Aleph is David talking about his sin, and right.
Right, and not for nothing. I'm just saying, you got two high level people both saying, yeah, was there a sin here? Yeah.
Right.
So Chazal want to walk it back. I'm sorry, the people themselves are telling you.
So let's see how Chazal walk it back. This is Shabbos 56a. Amar Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonasan, Kol ha'omer David chata, Eino ela toeh. Anybody who says that David sinned is making a mistake. And I'm going to spare you the ample apologetics that try to have their cake and eat it too, where they say, it's not that the Chazal are saying that David didn't sin. They're saying you can't say that David sinned because that he later on did teshuvah. Or if you say you shouldn't say that he sinned, you should say that he was toeh. That's just a misreading of the Gemara. Shenemar vayhi David l'chol derachav maskil v'Hashem imo. Right, the pasuk later on in Shmuel, and I'm sorry, earlier on in Shmuel Aleph, Parak 18 says that, excuse me, that David succeeded in all of his ways and Hashem was with him. So how is it possible to say such a thing if he sinned? Which is a little complicated because we didn't say that after he sinned. We said that before he sinned. But after chataba liyado ushchina imo, is it possible that a sin would come to him and still Hashem would be with him? No, Hashem's not going to be with somebody who's a sinner. Ella mani makayim. How can I fulfill the an understanding of the pasuk that says Madua bazisas dvar Hashem lasos hara? That's Natan Navi later on is going to come and give David patch. It means that shebikesh lasos velo asa, because the term over there is es dvar Hashem bazisa es dvar Hashem laasos hara, to do in the future, but not having actually done the evil thing. Amar Rav. So Rav doesn't like this any more than Charles does. Rebbe de Asami David mahafich v'darsh b'zuchusei de David. Rav says, no way. David sinned. You Rebbe, who are of the lineage of David HaMelech, we'll see, please God, when we finish Shmuel and we move on to Perkei Avos, we'll learn a little bit more about Rebbe and his yichus and why he might be taking up David's defense over here. But you came from David, so mahafich v'darsh b'zchusei de David. So it's you have a kind of a vested interest in making these drushes to protect David. What do I do with the pasuk? Madu bazis dvar Hashem lasos hara. Rabbi Omer mishuna ra zu mikol ra'osha b'Torah. This ra, this phrase in the Tanakh is different than everywhere else that you find in the Torah. Shekol ra'osha b'Torah ksiv buhu vayas. V'kan ksiv la'asos. Shebikesh la'asos v'lo asa. Normally, when someone does something evil in the Torah, it says vayas. Here it says la'asos, which implies that the intent was to do ra, but he didn't actually accomplish the ra. Now, Moshe Isaacson, on my own, did a little research into the term la'asos hara, and actually you find it in several places in both the Chumash, in Sefer Shoftim, and other places, and it's referring to people who actually did the ra. So we'll leave that as an aside. As Uriah Chiti hikisa b'cherev shahaya lecha laduno b'sanhedrin below danta. So what does it mean that you killed Uriah with the sword? It means that you should have taken him to court, and you didn't. So, in other words, Uriah Chiti was definitely chayiv misa because he was more b'malchus. The only problem was that you technically should have brought him to Beis Din, and you didn't do that. But really, you're still not chayiv for killing him. That's A. And B, when Natan says that you took Vias Ishta Lakach L'chol Isha, it implies that she was available for Lekuchin, meaning you could have taken her. The Amar Reb Shmuel bar Nachmani, this is the famous statement. Amar Reb Yonasan, Kol Hayozel L'Mechemes Beis David, Kosev Get Krisus L'Ishto. Anybody who goes out to war from David's army would write this conditional divorce and give it to their wife. Shenemar v'esaser scharitze chalav ha'elet havila sar ha'alef. this is way back when David was going to check on his brothers, like we mentioned before. He's got to bring the 10 rolls of cheese to the head officer, and then go check on your brothers. And you have to bring their arubasam. That's this weird word. It means a pledge. And so the interpretation of the word arubasam means my arubasam. Telling Rabbi Yosef, dvarim hamuravim beino leveino. It's a play on the word aruvasam as like a mu'urav, to be something that involves both him and her, and what could involve both the husband and the wife. It must be this conditional get. Just like you wouldn't be punished, David, if someone died in battle through the sword of Bnei Ammon. My taima, why are you not punished for the death of Uriah Chiti? Because he was a rebel against the crown. Because he mentioned either he mentioned Yoav before he mentioned David, or he called Yoav my master in the presence of David. Amarav kima anta be David lo mashkachach be bar midu Uriah dechsiv rak bedavar Uriah Chiti. This is the only sin that David did, was the sin with Uriah Chiti. Okay, we'll get into the rest. I think we can leave. Okay, so two points that Chazal are trying to make over here. One is that Uriah Chiti was chayev misa anyway, and so David is not held culpable for killing him because he should have been killed. And two is that David didn't take Batsheva illicitly. She was technically divorced at the time. Is that satisfying?
Well, it sounds like you have a primary and a secondary, because both of them are kind of schmach.
Okay. Are they even together? Are they good?
Yeah.
Right. So the idea of the conditional divorce, I actually found myself kind of okay with, because that's something that like Jews would think of and that makes sense. Because you got, Rahman al-Islam, you got this hostage situation, and you got, in Israel, and like they're ones who I think that could really sort of, conceptualize, hey, somebody might get captured. It's better his wife shouldn't be an aguna. Like the idea of the soldiers divorcing their wives, like I'm kind of okay with that. But the whole idea of David didn't sin, and it's like jumping through the hoops that, oh no, really, Uriah's born b'machos, and this, like that kind of strikes me as weak.
Right. Okay, I hear that. What do we have any indication from the text as to whether or not Uriah and Batsheva were in fact married? Meaning they were for sure married at the beginning, right? David asks who she is, and they tell him that she's a married woman. I guess there's a couple things that I would kind of challenge this idea of this conditional get. The first is that if we follow this line of reasoning, then anybody can sleep with any wife of someone who's gone to the army, because they're all magically sort of in a limbo state. It's not clear from the Gemara, is the get retroactive to the time that they left to go to war, or right before they died, right? When you say, what's the purpose of this retroactive get? It's so that you don't have an aguna. The guy goes out to war and then you don't hear from him. Can you trigger the get, right?
Or you have to get remarried.
Right. No. If you don't know, if he goes out to war and doesn't return, you don't know that he's dead. If you don't know that he's dead, then the wife is an aguna, because.
But if you're saying that the get is activated at the time of giving, then it must they get a new kedushin.
Correct.
If it's activated at the time of death, then if you come back home, you're still married.
Correct.
There's no new kedushin.
Exactly.
Right. Well, I always thought of it, because of the idea of capture, like prolonged capture, I always wondered, the way I justified is that it had like a time limit. If I do not return home within 2 years,
yeah.
Right. Okay. Consider yourself divorced from this moment.
That's what I'm trying to push in on. Divorced from the time I hand it to you,
right,
and then go out to battle,
that's
or
right.
Right. So if that either way, it becomes fishy for a number of reasons. One is it leaves all. If you say it's from the time that I handed it to you and went out to war, then it leaves all these women available for people to do exactly what David did. Meaning, David is, in doing this, would be setting a precedent that would undermine the whole process.
For the Amish.
Yeah, right. It kind of makes a mockery of the whole thing when the army is out fighting and anybody can go sleep with the wives of anybody in the army.
No, I'm not
Sort
saying
of,
that they should. Like, I mean, because if you do, then retroactively it's adultery.
well, so that takes me to the next point. What are you, David, doing telling Uriah to go back home? If you
Right.
tell Uriah to go back home, then you're undoing the get,
Right.
right? Because either she's divorced and then if Uriah goes back home, it implies that he has to remarry her, or by going back home, you're showing that the get is invalid and therefore what you did was adultery at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the third problem I have is the end of the parak where we find out Vatishma Eshes Uriah ki meis Uriah Isha Vatispod al Ba'ala. That sounds like they're pretty married, right?
Mm-hmm. The pasuk saying it.
Yeah.
Right. You can't argue with that.
So that's the problem I have with the conditional get. Besides the fact that it doesn't actually say that he gave her a get in the text, but okay, we'll rely on Chazal for that.
Right.
Then we have the Mor b'malchus issue, which also doesn't convince me.
Right. This doesn't say like I'm giving you a king's command that you need to go. Hey, go home, buddy. You know.
Right.
Like it's not freight. Like if the king says, "Hey, you know, you could go to like any of these rooms. You know, maybe you pick room number 1 or room number 2. You know, and then the guy picks room number 3. It's like, all right, it was ambiguous. You know.
Yeah. So I think Chazal are dinging him more, not because he didn't go home, but more for his speech. Either don't refer to Yoav as Adoni Yoav when you're talking to the king,
Right.
or don't put Yoav before you put David. If you're going to
Right.
talk about anybody, talk about David and then Yoav.
Yeah.
But Yoav himself chews out David back when Avner came to visit, right? Avner comes to David and says, like, let's bury the hatchet, and Yoav finds out about it, and he starts like really slamming David for that. And there's nobody talks about Mor b'malchus over there.
Right.
I don't, just from reading the text, if you hadn't told me that it was Mor b'malchus, it wouldn't have jumped out to me as, oh wow, look what Uriah is doing.
Yeah.
Plus, we talked about this also. It's a little ambiguous whether or not Uriah knows that David slept with his wife. But if he does know, then I can kind of forgive him for mentioning Yoav before David. Like,
Right.
know,
Like seriously.
right. So there is a third Gemara, and that's in Avodah Zarah 4b. By third Gemara, I forgot to mention to you that there's more discussion about this in Sanhedrin 107a. We're not going to read that inside just for the sake of time. Amr b'Yochanan mishum Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Lo David roy la'oso maisa, v'lo Yisrael ru'uyim la'oso maisa. David should never have, this whole situation with Batsheva should never have happened. It must have been orchestrated by God. The same way the Jewish people should never have worshipped the Egel HaZahav. Lo David roy la'oso maisa, dechsiv libi chalal b'kirbi. David, it's impossible that this was just happened because David was someone who wanted to go sleep with a married woman, because David says about himself that my heart is like Chalal b'kirbi is like is nervous all the time to avoid sin. The Jewish people should never worship the Egel HaZahav. Hashem says they're Yirei Shamayim. So why did it happen? Lomer Lacha, to tell you, Shimchata Yachid, that if an individual over the expanse of time, any individual who sins, Omrim Lo, they say to him, Klach Eitzel Yachid, why don't you go look at David as the paragon for Teshuvah? Vimchatu Tzibor, and if a whole community sins, Omrim Lo, Klach Eitzel Tzibor. Utzrich, and I need both the individual who did Teshuvah and the Kahal that did Teshuvah, Diashmin an Yachid, if I only had the case of the individual of David Mishum Delo Mefarsim Chitoi, because his sin wasn't publicly known, so then I can understand why he was able to do teshuvah. Aval tzibor de mefarsim chatayu emalo. Maybe a whole tzibor can't do teshuvah because it's a big chil Hashem. Everybody knows. V'yesh me'inan tzibor mishum d'nefishe rachmayu. And if I only had a case of the tzibor doing teshuvah and not the yachid, I might think the reason that the tzibor is forgiven is because there's a whole bunch of people, so God's gonna have more rachmanas. Aval yachid lo alima zechuse emalo, but maybe you won't forgive the individual. Why is David referred to as the one who bore the yoke? Ne'um David ben Yishai shehekim ulo shel teshuvah. that David is the paragon of teshuvah, that if David can do such a sin and still recover from it, so that gives hope to any individual who has sinned to say, look, I can take a lesson from David, and he was such a great person, fell so far and was still able to do teshuvah, so I can certainly do teshuvah. That is the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. I think what that Gemara is putting its finger on or gesturing towards is that we have to make sense on a human level of what David did. It's impossible to just say David HaMelech snapped and went from being like the paragon of righteousness to violating 2 out of the 3 of the Yarek Val Yavors in the span of like 3 prakim, right? It doesn't make any sense. So that pushed me to try to find something that will make like a framework to understand why he did what he did, first from a human or a psychological level, and then to try and extrapolate that to a conceptual level. And I'm going to do my best here, and I hope you guys can sort of follow along till the end, and then you can tell me if it works for you. And like I said, I don't want to turn David HaMelech into just, he's just a regular person like us, and he has taivas, and that's not where I'm trying to go. And I want to try to be cognizant of not reducing the awe that we should have for David HaMelech. He's David HaMelech. But if we don't understand it from a human level and then expand upon it, then we can't learn anything from it, I think. So I looked around at the Torah to try to find a parsha that can help us understand why David did what he did.
Tamar.
Not quite. And I came up with something that I think is rather interesting. So I'll present it to you, and you can tell me what you think. I found afterwards like one blog post that in a footnote references sort of the same idea from Rabbi David Silber. So it made me feel a little bit better about it, because I think Rabbi Silber has probably forgotten more about Sefer Shmuel than I will ever know. But if you don't buy it, I will take the onus on myself, because I haven't heard it directly from Rabbi Silber. To me, this whole story with David sort of sounds like a corrupted version of the parsha in the Torah called Yifat Toar. So we have Kitzei al Milchama lo Yivecha, that when the Jewish army goes out to battle and they take captives, there is we'll call it a dispensation. There's an allowance for taking a married woman and sleeping with her. I know there's a whole discussion and machlokas whether or not you're allowed to sleep with her once beforehand or not. We're just going to go with the standard understanding, which is that the soldier is allowed to sleep with this woman, and then he can't sell her, whatever. She goes through a whole process of integration into the Jewish people. This is the only time that I'm aware of where there are a lot of halachos that are basically abrogated. So the Rambam talks about when you go out to war, you can eat treif, there's a lot of things that you can violate. So it's not just Eishes Ish, but this is the only time that I'm aware of where someone can violate Eishes Ish with the permission of the Torah. The reason I think that applies to this situation is because we have several statements from Chazal that David actually has a number of children from Yifat Toar. There is a Gemara. There's a Gemara I'll read to you from Sanhedrin 21a. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Arba Meos Yeladim Hayu Lo David. David had 400 children. The Kulam Bnei Yifat Toar Hayu, and they were all children from Yifat Toar. Umegadli Blurios Hayu, and they would grow their hair in this like non-Jewish style. I always think of like the Jedi that have the long whatever. The Blurios is like a non-Jewish hairstyle.
Like a mullet.
Yeah, something like that. The Kulan Yoshivim Bikranu Shel Zahav, and they all were transported in these golden carriages. Mahalchim Baroshe Gaisos Hayu, and they were the heads of the army. Vehem Hayu Baile Agrofim Shel Beis David, and they were like the muscle of the house of David. V'amar Yehuda Amar Rav, Tamar Bas Yifat Toar Haisa, and Tamar was also the daughter of Yifat Toar. Shenemar This it explains why Tamar can tell Amnon that they would be allowed to be together. There's another Gemara earlier that I mentioned in Sanhedrin 107a. Amar the Navi is he's talking to David about Avshalom and trying to understand why David didn't realize that Avshalom would do what he was going to do. Amar, my taima kanisabas yafatoar. Why did you marry Yafatoar? Amar le Yafatoar. Rachmana Sharia. David says to the Navi, I'm allowed to marry Yafatoar. The Torah permitted. Amar le lo derash smuchim. Don't you know that there's smichos a parshios? What's the parsha after Yafatoar? The samach le ki yeli ish ben sorer moreh. So kol hanosa Yafatoar yeshlo ben sorer moreh, and that was Avshalom. So you have three separate descriptions of David having children from Yafat Toar. So it seems like this is something that David has we'll call it a proclivity towards, that David is there pacing on the roof when the Jewish people go out to war, because it's almost like it's a trigger. He knows that when it's wartime, this is something that he's done in the past, is go and take a Yafat Toar, and what he ends up doing is a corrupted version of that, essentially, in taking Batsheva.
King Shlomo has kind of that with like Paro, right? Like,
so that's not war driven,
right?
Right.
It's peace driven.
Did you
Right.
say that all three of the from that incident, like Amnon, Tamar, and Avshalom, are all from the Passover?
Not
No.
Amnon. Tamar,
Amnon,
Avshalom, and then these 400 other children.
So Amnon
I
was
thought
from one
Amnon
of the.
was, no?
Amnon was
No.
from one of the.
Amnon was from one of his wives.
wives.
Yeah. Okay, so that I guess helps us understand a little bit about where David is coming from, but I think there's more to uncover here. David was just told beforehand that he's going to have a dynasty, and this is the first thing that he does after he finds out about that, besides going to war. If we look at back to the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, when we talked about the introduction to this whole book, and we were talking about where Shaul comes from, we mentioned the story of Pilegesh Begiva, and how the outcome of that story was that the Shevet of Binyamin was almost completely wiped out. What had to happen was that the men that were left in Shevet Binyamin had to basically go out, and this is Tu B'Av, and go grab the girls who were dancing in the Krumim, right? So you're getting kind of shades of the same idea, that Malchus, where Malchus of Shaul comes from, this idea of the men coming and grabbing women who wouldn't necessarily otherwise be available to them. But I think this whole concept actually appears multiple times in the Torah, and it's almost a fundamental issue. The issue is people in a position of power seeing something they want and taking it, whether they're allowed to take it or not. And it comes up multiple times, specifically in the types of scenarios that David is in. You have with Shechem taking Dinah. You have with Paro and Avimelech taking Sarah, right? It's the same idea. The king sees somebody that he wants, and he takes them whether or not they're available to him. Really, this takes us back to the series we had on Gan Eden, that in the 6th parak of Bereshis, you have the Bnei Elohim see the Benot Hadam, that they are tovot, and they take them whether or not they're supposed to. And that leads to the Mabul and everything else that it leads to. And at the time, we explained that this is really part of the fundamental issue with the Eitz Hadat, that the Eitz Hadat, the sin over there at its, you'll forgive the pun, at its root is Chava seeing something that she wants and taking it even though it's not available to her. And that what that sin is in its essence is the assertion of an independent perspective from God, right? God says, this is not available to you. And you say, oh, yes, it is, right? I see this as a parent. When you have a kid that's like 3 years old and you tell them, don't do that, that's dangerous, they say, of course I'm not going to do it, because this person over here who seems to know everything about the world told me that this is dangerous. It must be dangerous, right? And then they get to be like 6 or 7, and you're like, don't do that, that's dangerous. And they're like, I hear you. I know that you know stuff, but I want to assert my own independence, and I'm going to evaluate whether or not that thing is dangerous by touching it and playing with it, right? And my assessment of reality is independent of your assessment of reality. So I know you, God, said that this is not to be done, but I don't care. I'm going to do it because I have the power to do it on my own. I'm my own independent thing. That is the problem with the Eitz Hadat, and that's always the problem when someone sins. What they're doing is saying, I know you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said no. I hear you. I don't care because I exist and I can evaluate things independent of you. I can assert my power over this thing and take it or manipulate or whatever, be involved with it independent of what you and your ratzon is. That is the core problem of this book, because we talked about a few weeks ago how the entire role of Malchus is to be subservient to the Ratzon Hashem. You can't be a melech if you assert anything of your own, because, like we said, then how does the cloud that you're meleching know whether what you're doing is your own Ratzon or God's? The only way it works, and that's why we talked about how important it was that David has a lave that follows after HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because the second you don't follow after HaKadosh Baruch Hu, now there's two people grabbing the wheel. And we, the community, don't know who's giving us instruction. Is God giving us instruction through David, or is it David giving us instruction independent of God? Right? We're gonna have to table how we grapple with that, because the next question it will lead us to is, well, then how is David any better than Shaul? In fact, he's probably a lot worse than Shaul. Shaul, yeah, he sinned, but he sinned either because there was ruach ra that was driving him crazy, or he sinned in this minor way with Amalek before that happened. But David's sins are without any ruach ra, and they're significantly worse than anything that Shaul did in his lifetime.
Repeat.
What's that?
And potentially repeat.
Right. So if Shaul was kicked out of the kingship, then why does David get to have it perpetuate forever after? Okay, is that
chosenness versus non-chosenness?
Right. So that we'll try to get to that.
I mean, that's a pretty harsh answer.
So the other thing I think that's important to point out is that all of this entire incident is the exact inverse of what happened with Boaz. Boaz was in a position to see someone that he wanted and to take her and to exert his power over her without any repercussions, right? Ruth presents herself to Boaz and he says, I love you. I'm super interested, but I'm not going to do that. That's what leads to Malchus. That's the seed of Malchus itself was that particular incident. What that whole story, and we did a whole bunch of shiurim on Rus, but what that story dances around, even though it's not necessarily a mitzvah in the text itself, is the concept of yibum. And I think yibum is sort of the antidote to a lot of this, but we have to go back to Gan Eden for a second. Without giving away the whole next parak, David, the Navi Natan comes to David and he tells him this story about a rich man and a poor man, and the poor man has this sheep who he loves and treats like a member of his family, and the rich man takes the sheep and slaughters it. So the mashal over there, the purpose of that mashal at its essence, I think, is to tell David that you misunderstood the whole point of you as a melech. You are supposed to be a shepherd, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to David, I plucked you from the pasture, right? You were a shepherd. The job of the shepherd is to do the exact opposite of what David just did. You're supposed to guard the thing that people come and take, right? What we said, the core of David's sin was, I have the power to take something, and I'm going to exert that power on the thing, right? The lion comes and wants the sheep, the bear comes, and the job of the shepherd is to prevent the person from exercising that evil ratzon, from exercising their power to take the thing, whether or not they're supposed to take it, right? You, David, were supposed to be a shepherd. That was your whole mahus. That's your whole essence. That also goes back to Bereshis. We have Cain and Hevel. There are two modes of operating in the world. One of them is Hevel, is to be a shepherd, right? Cain has a different mode, which is there's one way where it's okay for you to see and take, and that's if you invest. If you're a shepherd, if you're a farmer like Cain, so then it's okay to take the produce because you invested. You're not exerting power over it. It's a relationship. I invested in this thing, and so I have a relationship with it. The other approach to reality is Hevel. Hevel is the shepherd. Boaz is not a shepherd. He's a farmer, right? So you have both of those things coming into play as the foundation of Malchus. You have Boaz refusing to operate as the seeing and taking, and you also have him as the farmer. So Okay, I think we can. We'll see how this plays out, I guess, a little bit more in a few prakim, because David is going to have this whole concept of someone in a position of power seeing and taking something that they're not supposed to, is going to come back to happen in David's own family in his own lifetime as a punishment for the thing that he did. But I think that just to kind of summarize where we've been, we saw statements from Chazal that want to present David as not having sinned. And I think the reason for that is because it's, like we saw in the last Gemara, it's hard to make sense of the transition from a David who was completely righteous to a David who does these things that seem out of left field. And so we offered as a rationalization or a psychological perspective on it, the template of Yafat Toar. And we said that David seems to constantly be involved in this concept of Yafat Toar, and we traced that to start with the beginning of Malchus and the Malchus of Shaul specifically as the outcome of the Pelegish Begiva story and how people would go and grab the girls. But then we tried to add a little bit more of we'll say, a theological perspective to it, and understood that this concept of Yafat Toar is just an echo of the general sin of people who are in a position of power seeing and taking independent of whether or not they're allowed to. We find that play out all over in Tanakh, especially in relation to men and kings, or in the case of Shem, a prince, but people. And this is also true of the story of Yosef and Ashes Potiphar in reverse, right? She's in the position of power, and he's the one that she's not supposed to be taking, and she's trying to do exactly that same thing. We traced that back to the chait in Gan Eden, and then we talked about how what should have happened, what the role of the melech is to be a shepherd, is to prevent people from doing this exact thing, from seeing and taking, and that the foundation of Malchus, the Boaz paradigm, is someone who can be in that situation and refuse to exert that power. That's essentially what you. Oh, that's I think what I didn't cover completely. Yibum is that same idea that you're not taking the wife as an exertion of power. In fact, you might have no interest in her. The only reason you're taking her is to shepherd her, is to protect either the name of the brother, so that you can perpetuate the name of the brother, and or to shepherd, to protect the woman, right? The woman who loses her husband, has no children to fend for her. She's in a very bad position, especially in the ancient world. So the brother who comes and takes her into his home and offers her support and a child, so the brother has no interest in this woman other than to take care of her, right? This isn't someone that he sought out initially to have a relationship with. His brother did, but the brother's dead. So I'm coming in now more as a shepherd than I am as someone who has interest in the relationship for itself. That's why we find it sort of hinted out throughout the story of Sefer Rus. It's the same reason that it exists by the story of Yehuda and Tamar, which is also kind of in line with what we've been discussing over here. But I think that adds enough sort of conceptual framework.
This is the end, beautiful friend. Thank you for joining us on our journey of learning, and I hope you will tune in for another episode soon, Mirz Hashem. Be well.